Hello, Ramon, with my rolling R.
This is
Welcome to
very,
the show.
very well done. Very well done. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here, Lian.
I am so excited about this conversation. It's two of my favorite topics together. I don't know if you've heard of the term idea sex, where you take two ideas and bring them together, and then they have sex and produce a beautiful baby. I feel like it's a bit like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the concept before, maybe not with that specific language, but I have come across the notion that ideas and even cultures and any number of elements of human sort of society and world can intermingle and have babies. Yeah.
Well, we're going to produce a beautiful one today. And in fact, actually, this is quite a good place to start, in that I'm speaking as if our sort of ancestral inheritance and magic are separate ideas, when to me, and I believe to you, they're not at all. It's only in our modern world that we've created a split between them. And so in a way, in this conversation, like putting them back together, for me, actually is how they're meant to be. They actually are meant to be two sides of the same coin. So let's dive in. I would love to know, I know that your childhood was a bit different to most. And so this idea of magic is something that you were, I guess, inducted into early. I'd love to know two things. When you're saying magic, how do you define that? And two, what did that look like for you growing up?
Yeah, those are excellent questions that definitely interweave for me. So, in terms of magic, well, I suppose magic at a core level could be looked at as the human being having influence in the world in ways that are not necessarily directly causal, the way that we would define it in today's modern world. The ability to tap into underlying currents of energy and or the mystery that creates these worlds, and to participate actively in that process. And that human beings have been doing so since we've been definably human, however long that is, and probably even before that. We talk about proto-humans, etc., early hominids. And so that type of reality, I think, exists because at some level, the universe works according to magical principles. And so in a lot of ways, I think of that as simply an element of physics that we used to know and that we in the modern world don't really tap into anymore as much, and especially in the modern Western world. And so magic, as we know it, is about engaging with that reality. So for me in my early childhood, I was actually I grew up in a household that was devoted to a branch of magical tradition that comes from the African diaspora. So I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's called Santeria.
No,
and
I
so
haven't.
yeah, so Santeria is a form of syncretic tradition that emerged when the slave trade came to the Caribbean. And because the slave traders and the slave masters, so to speak, were Catholic, the Africans who wanted to continue to practice their tradition made it syncretic with Catholicism. And so they ended up, so they ended up hiding their deities inside of Catholic saints that most resembled their gods from Africa. So it was a very interesting tradition. I mean, so this is a very, very serious, very potent magical tradition with its roots somewhere, it's estimated, between 8 to 10,000 years ago. So it's a living tradition that touches the end of the Paleolithic era. And it's been an ongoing living tradition with an unbroken set of practices for at least that long. And so it really is a truly deep ancestral inheritance in regards to magic. And so a lot of that still made it into this Santeria practice. The roots of the tradition are actually the Ifa tradition. It's called the Ifa and Orisha tradition. Orishas are the gods that we're talking about. And the Ifa tradition is like a canon of wisdom, basically. It's a very large canon of wisdom, and it's actually the largest and most complex oracle on the planet. Or at least it possesses the largest and most complex oracles on the planet. And so, yeah, my household was devoted completely to this tradition because my grandmother, that's what she did for a living. She was a santera. And what you might call a witch, so to speak, as in very real, very involved witchcraft in consistent communication with spirits. And so I was initiated into this tradition when I was an infant, about a year and a half old, which is very uncommon because it's a very involved initiation. So just to be clear too, this tradition has animal sacrifice in it, a lot of animal sacrifice at times. There is the initiations require work from an entire community of people over weeks and weeks to do with very, very real, in-depth communal ritual in order to consecrate a wide variety of pots that possess these deities inside of them, lots of divinations, and the initiation takes a year to complete. And so you have to like devote a whole year to the process.
Wow.
So I went through that one. Yeah, I went through that when I was a baby. And so that's probably influenced my perception in ways that I can't fully appreciate. And then I grew up with my grandmother, where she was at some level preparing me to take over her business, I suppose, because that's what she had a client base and she devoted her life to that. And so I got a lot of magical training in indigenous forms of magic when I was really young. And I grew up,
May I ask a quick question there?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Was it that your grandmother was guided by spirit that you were meant to take over from her? Was there this clear sense of lineage and you were kind of the next one in that line?
Yes, as far as I can tell. Yeah. I'm not sure that we would have used that language at that point in time. But looking back through time, it does appear so. Yeah. Yeah. So when a lot of kids were learning how to use tools and play sports and things like that, I was learning how to do magic. It's funny though, I did actually have a little bit of a falling out with magic when I turned about 16 or 17. It's a long story, a lot of complicated layers to it that is not important, I think, to share. But I ended up, I started meditating and doing energy work when I was about 17, and I stepped away from the tradition. And I ended up having like a really intense, really destabilizing Kundalini syndrome effect that literally almost killed me. And so then that sent me on a whole different trajectory for about a decade. And then it was about 10 years later where I started to dive way deeper into the magical practice again, at least what we would call formal magical practice. And so, yeah, that's how that's developed for me. And I've had the blessing of learning from some very amazing teachers in the last, 8 years or so.
Wow, what a story. I love that you referenced, there's ways that kind of upbringing will have shaped your perception in ways that you can never know, because clearly we can only ever know what we've been shown, what we've been aware of. And it's very challenging to kind of even, I guess, imagine another worldview. For so many of us, we're in the work one way or another of reclaiming a magical worldview. But I love the fact that that was all you knew. But I also feel there's something really powerful that you then stepped away from it. And so you did have your own reclamation of sorts. And I think in some ways that for me, listening makes that even more of, I don't know, you were able, I guess, to come back to it in a way where it felt very much like a choice. To an extent, we don't have a choice when we're raised into something, but you've then actively chosen back into it, which for me is kind of makes that even richer. So that's a really beautiful start. And I also really love the way that you defined magic at the beginning. So for people listening, most of us won't have been raised in that kind of worldview, wouldn't have had that kind of upbringing. And I think there's something really really powerful in your story, which is ultimately pointing back to the fact, like, this is actually all of our birthright. This is all of our heritage. It's just most of us are going to have to reclaim it. You could say in some ways, like, much further back place. I don't necessarily know, you know, time is linear in quite that way when we're talking about these things. Hey, we're talking about magic, but still there is definitely, I guess, more for us, for most of us, to do in that reclamation. But I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about what you've seen about that in terms of it being something that very much is an inheritance.
Sure. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, I like to think of it almost like a lizard. It's a metaphor that I use. It's like a lizard regenerating its tail, right? It's almost as if there's this innate, inherent part of us that is supposed to be there, but that it's been chopped off by these outside forces. And so the essence of it, the layers of it that allow it to work, to be a tail, so to speak, that type of intelligence is present. We just have to regrow it, most of us, right?
Oh, I love that so much. That's become one of my new favorite metaphors. I'll certainly be quoting you on that forevermore. I love that. Yes, I can feel the truth of that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think at the root of where that process really takes hold is in animism, right? And being able to perceive the world as an animist. And there is a animist thinker, a podcaster that I really appreciate. His name is Josh Schrei. And he says that animism is normative consciousness, that it's basically the normal way for human beings to perceive the world. And
Yes, I so agree with that.
yeah. And it's to me, that's a core truth. And that is the layer of work, a big layer of the work to be done is to look at all the ways in which modern culture has removed animist thought, has decentralized the animate, right? Because we think of objects, so to speak, as inanimate, right? And one of the ways to kind of reshift that is to realize that the inanimate is not really a thing, but it's really the animate. And to find ways to reinforce that continuously in our perception, and that's how we regrow. And then that puts us back into this immersive relationship with the rest of the world. Because the scientific paradigm, while very useful, tries to pull the human being out of this immersive relationship. It's literally to become an outside observer, as if that were, as if that were even possible, right? That's an assumption. Yeah, that's a type of metaphysics that is interwoven into the scientific paradigm. That you can't even do that is an assumption. But setting that aside, that's what the scientific paradigm, which influences much of the modern Western world and is at the root of disconnecting us from these magical layers of perception, is doing. And so magic in a lot of ways requires the opposite. It's about being immersed in and in relationship with the rest of the world. It's about understanding that that is the truth, is that, you know, you can't really separate this relational aspect from everything else. At some layer, you know, what even are you as an individual, if not for an interweaving of many different forces and processes and environmental factors and spiritual forces, and right, it's all of that. And so the reclamation, I think, if we're looking at magic from an ancestral inheritance perspective, is starting with animism. And then at some level, I think it's also useful to not think of animism so much as a thing. You know, when we look at indigenous cultures, before anthropology designated this, there was no word for animism. It just was, like animism is an anthropological word that was used in almost a derogatory fashion to talk about this mistake in perception that these indigenous people were making. When for every indigenous culture, it was just the ocean in which we swam, the water, you know, that we were in. It was just the world is alive and we are alive with it. Yeah.
The word life, just as you said it, I was just like, you know, we do have a word for life, but it's not dissimilar, is it? It's like, it is just what it is. That's really hit me. It's really hit me. Yeah, I feel, you know, some grief, actually. You know, the way you're speaking about it, these are things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about it, but the way that you've spoken about it at like such almost like a first principles level has like hit me a whole nother depth of like, oh my goodness, like this truly is just how it is to be human, is to view the world, to not even view the world, to like experience the world, be immersed in the world in that way. That's huge.
Yeah. I totally understand the grief part of it. I can totally connect and relate to you in that regard. Yeah. So for me, it's interesting because when I turned 17, I ended up rejecting magic, right? I went into the scientific paradigm, and I turned 17, and of course, as you said, I was raised in this tradition. So it's almost as if there's a layer of being a teenager that has to rebel against the things
Yes.
that they grow up in.
Yeah.
And so I
Natural
did.
too, yes.
Yeah, so I did as well. Even though I went into energy work and the scientific paradigm, and I never went into science from a purely materialistic perspective. But
No, you didn't do like the best rebellion, in fairness.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I didn't really succeed at it. Yeah, but I so there are a lot of layers to why that ended up happening, including aspects of my story that felt imposed upon me. Because a part of what happens in this tradition when you get initiated into it is that you're given this very large, very in-depth divination that is supposed to then guide, in some senses, how you live your life. And because yeah, it's very, very in-depth, very deep, very specific, very unique to you. It happens over multiple days. It takes hours each day to do. It's a book that's a literal physical book that's given to you with all of that written in. Yeah, it's called an Ita, ITA. And when a lot of people get initiated into this tradition, they're already older. You know, they're in their teens, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s. And so the context of a divination like that is taken differently. Whereas for me, I literally
can I just say there, like, I'm listening thinking, I want that. You know, like most of us that, you know, haven't been raised in that way are like desperate for divinations, you know, whether it be tarot, astrology, human design, gene keys, like literally a day doesn't go by without someone saying to me, oh, I've had another, whatever the reading might be. But I completely get there's a real difference between those of us that haven't been raised with that kind of divination being kind of at the core of our life versus someone that's kind of like not had the opportunity to like not have it and then want it. Yeah.
Sure. And you know, I mean, I do divination too, right? So I totally get that. It's very helpful. It's just that I grew up with it, and it was almost as if I felt trapped to this divination, including the certain layers of the divination, despite the fact that my family handled it the best way they could. Certain aspects of it were layered in fear. And it's sort of, in some ways, the divination almost created this core wound for me. And it traveled
although
throughout
whether it was, you know, you never know with these things, you know, it's that whole kind of premonition, manifestation. Is there really, you know, like, it's all like the more and more I see the way that things really work, it's like you can't really tease the two apart. Like it's kind of whatever is spoken is what was already going to happen, and it's all happening at once anyway. But I can appreciate as a, you know, as a boy growing up with something, some of which is quite scary, you're going to feel this sense of like that divination always almost made this happen rather than it be a kind of foretelling of what was already going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Yeah, so for me, that was a part of wanting to leave the tradition, was not wanting to feel as if my destiny were something that I had no say in. And so
Mm.
I literally, while this is usually a no-no, I literally burned that book and
Oh,
and
oh my
decided to,
gosh.
yeah, and decided to kind of, choose my own path through life. And a part of that was leaving behind the traditions and the magical thinking and perception, and to which, to some degree, right, as you said, I didn't do a good job at rebelling. And so I had to actually go through the process that I think a lot of people are trying to go through now in reclaiming magic, even though I had grown up in a magical tradition.
Mm.
I actually got to see the layers that get in the way of being able to engage with magic, right? And so,
Yes. I
yeah,
love that. Mm.
and I mean, a lot of it comes down to basically just being told by modern Western society that it is simply not real, and the layers of why it's not real. And a lot of it has to do with this superiority complex that
Mm.
Western society has it has the monopoly on truth, and that other ways of knowing and other ways of engaging with the world that are not aligned with that monopoly are false. And so when most people talk about magic not being real, I ask them, how have you engaged with magic to possibly know that? Who told you this? Where did you get these ideas? um, there's a magical uh, a magician that I really appreciate named Gordon White, who says that if you don't think magic is real, take a Ouija board into an abandoned insane asylum at night. And
Oh, I got chills
yeah, yeah, and yeah, and then see what happens, right? And I bet you that most of the people who do not believe in magic would not want to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, because at some level there's a recognition that, oh yeah, that would be that would shake me to my core probably.
Yes.
Um, and so a lot of it is looking for the places in which your perception has not really been influenced by direct experience, where it's been something that's
Mm.
been given to you by these outside authorities, whether directly or indirectly, and learning to unweave that and getting curious enough to start actually engaging with the types of practices that can only exist in an animate universe. um,
Mm.
that's the way I really like to approach it, is engaging with the practices first, and then trying to look for the layers of dissonance that are creating static with those practices, with that perception, as you go through it, and look for where the
Yeah.
source of that is. Yeah.
Mm. I love this so, so much. And also the kind of pragmatic nature you have about this, again, having gone through that reclamation yourself in a more, I guess, it's not more conscious way, but I think because of your upbringing, you've had a chance to experience it in a way that kind of makes you the perfect teacher for this. What's interesting is my upbringing wasn't as obviously consciously kind of immersed in magic in the way that yours was, but it, compared to most in this modern world, it really was. I was raised by a father who, I only found this out actually a few years ago after his death, that he was a kind of practicing magician while I was in the womb.
Oh,
And
wow.
so yeah, I was raised where, like it was really normal to have tarot cards, use of psychedelics, so I was very like raised, in a magical worldview. And it wasn't as obviously kind of like different to the rest of the world as yours was, but it certainly was, very, very magical compared to most people in this modern culture. And then like you, I kind of rebelled against it and kind of, through fear, really, like I need to fit into this world. Therefore, I need to kind of look at the world in this very materialist way. And my own reclamation of a magical worldview began, I guess, actually when my father died 11 years ago. But what's really striking me now is it was kind of, slowly. The thing that made a big difference was when I consciously started training in shamanism, which, as you'll know, is like totally based on an Animus worldview. That made such a difference. It was like I was moving towards that naturally, and then it was like that, which is kind of like you can't even engage in that without that worldview. And I realized through this conversation, like that's what really has made a difference. Like it was like something shifted through that kind of like, and you say that's even a reclamation. Even those of us haven't been raised with that. This is a human worldview, as you say. This is the norm. This is our sort of baseline, and I can really see now that a return to that provides the foundation for anything else we might want to build on it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Lian. Yeah, and it makes sense that your process really shifted when you began practicing shamanism, because there's this layer of engagement, right? We have to actually be able to engage in order to come to the truth of it. It happens in the practice, so to speak.
Yes, you discover quite quickly what's actually real.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. It's easy to theorize about these things, but it's very different to get your hands on it, to feel the heat coming off the candles, the smoke coming off the incense, the praying process, the drumming, the actual spirits moving through your body and the energy of them moving through you, and you recognizing that, wow, there's something here that moves beyond my immediate perception. It's something that's also a very interesting layer of, I think, a part of what has to be navigated also in modern Western society for people who are trying to regrow the tail, so to speak, is that a lot of us tend to think, or let me put it this way, a lot of the narrative around modern ritual is very psychologized, right? We try to put the context of the ritual into a psychology language and into a psychology framework. And I understand why, because we grow up in a psychologized culture and that's our reference point. And obviously psychology has brought a lot of value to the modern Western person, but there's things that happen in ritual, especially from an Indigenous perspective, that completely fall outside the context of psychology. When you have not everything that we engage with exists exclusively in our own heads, right? There are forces in nature that we are engaging with. There are spirits that exist in some ways separate from us that are being touched. And there is a lot that happens that you simply can't put into that type of worldview, into a psychologized worldview. For example, in something that I got to witness a few times in the Ifa and Orisha tradition, there is this process of allowing the deities to completely, it's what you could call a full invocation, where they completely take over, so to speak. And the individual person completely falls away. And so then there is this deity that's inhabiting this person that's moving through a crowd and talking to people. And so from a modern psychology perspective, that there is no language for something like that, right? And
other than it's kind of like, if it was, it'd be like it's psychosis or schizophrenia or something.
Exactly. It's pathological. And that's kind of crazy when you think about it, when you look at this tradition that's literally creating a pathology out of something that is thousands of years old and inhabits many different indigenous cultures. And it's one of those layers where we have to recognize that that just because we have a worldview today doesn't necessarily mean that it is the innate human worldview. And I like to think about what a lot of us are dealing with today as almost being in a zoo. There are wild humans and then there are zoo humans. And a big part of like what I try to focus on with my work is escaping the zoo, so to speak. Yeah. And so wild humans have a very different orientation to the world, right? It's self-evident when you start to look around even a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Oh my goodness. This is one of those conversations where I just don't want it to end. I think you may have to come back on so we can do a part 2, because there's so much still that I want to journey through. What was it that just something just came to mind? What was that? Oh, that was it. When you're talking about, this modern worldview isn't necessarily the innate, well, almost certainly isn't the innate worldview, but it also, as we're describing, isn't necessarily the right, correct, true worldview. But I think the thing that's really struck me, both in this conversation, but also something that's kind of been in my awareness a lot over the last, say, 5 years, is, as you're saying, there's been a real dismissal of that innate worldview, as in it's less evolved, less intelligent. And the thing and I think in some ways I needed this permission, where I started to realize, as I went into this kind of very conscious reclamation of magic, it was really helpful for me to recognize that, both now in today's world, but also going back through time, some of our best thinkers, some of the most intelligent people, have had a magical worldview. There were so many examples of, inventors and engineers, scientists throughout time who have had a magical worldview, potentially secretly, but still they have. And again, in the last few years, I've interviewed people who are amongst the most intelligent, brilliant of my podcast guests, and hey, they've got a magical worldview. And I think I needed to experience that myself, to almost give myself permission of it isn't a stupid worldview. It isn't a lacking of awareness or intelligence. It's the opposite. It requires this, but in some ways, an actually more open scientific mind to actually look at what's going on and put aside, in some ways, of course, the zoo is mostly in here, isn't it? It's to be able to look outside the zoo to actually look for ourselves as to what's going on.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good point to bring up. Yeah. In my experience, at least in my view, it's a more whole worldview. It's a more holistic worldview that actually is able to take in more of the evidence, as you were saying, of what it's actually out there. It's interesting. It's almost a lot of the contemporary view that we're talking about that denies that magic is real. It's almost like willful ignorance. It's almost like not really looking at the true evidence, so to speak. And even inside the scientific paradigm, there have been a lot of studies done by militaries and governments on what we call psychic phenomenon, and those people are pretty convinced that stuff is real. In fact,
yes, I've had several guests on the show speaking about exactly that, and it's interesting that it suits them to see this. They wouldn't have any reason to unless it had efficacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've even seen reports come out at times referenced by other people who are really involved in that world of studying what comes out of the governmental studies in regards to psychic phenomenon, talking about how they should stop wasting time and money trying to prove it's real and put money into figuring out how to apply it as a weapon. And so, which of course is what the military does. That's what they're there for, right? It's to weaponize. But anyway, so the whole idea that it isn't real is really just a type of willful ignorance. And I mean, there's a lot of layers to why that's probably there. I think a big part of it too is fundamentally trying to keep people trapped, in a sense, you could say, disempowered, easily manipulated, more easy to herd, so to speak. Because when you start to really tap into the deeper currents of magic and you realize that there is all this power in the universe that you could align yourself with, these sources of power, whether it's ancestors or deities or natural forces, and that then you have to examine your own relationship to power, because it's difficult to engage with serious power and to direct it and to move with it without you yourself having to explore how you relate to power, and allowing yourself to become an instrument of power. And so to do that, I think gives a type of power back to people.
Yes.
And so yeah, there is just too much invested. I'm not pretending this is the only layer of it, but I think it's an important layer of it. That there's too much invested in keeping people small, contracted, segregated from the rest of the whole, and to keep them disempowered, to allow for a true embracing of the magical reality that we exist in, to infuse itself back into the popular culture.
Yeah.
It's what would happen all of a sudden if you had entire groups of people who were completely reconnected to these currents and started to engage with them and direct the flow of energy. It's a little bit too dangerous. And so, yeah, the modern world is kind of invested in keeping us not dangerous.
Yes. Safely in the zoo. Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so. And this is the wonderful thing. Someone could literally listen to this and begin the work of reclaiming that heritage, reclaiming their power. We can do this. That's what I feel so much. It's more than hope, actually. I just have deep trust that that's happening, that people are hearing that is possible, it's true, it's for them. Which actually, this might be a really good segue to asking you, and I love the way you've spoken a number of times where there is a kind of real practical element as to the way that I can see that you think, and also kind of inviting people into a magical reality. So I would love to know, for people listening, if they are hearing something in this for them, how do I start to see the world as potentially actually is? What sort of practices, rituals, thought experiments would you suggest for them to start to see things outside of this very limited modern worldview?
Sure. Yeah. So, well, one of the places I really like to start is with experiencing elemental forces inside of yourself. And I think that's a really easy way to start to approach the process. So learning to feel, water, fire, lightning, wind, earth, heaven, any number of these wild forces and these primal forces inside of your being, and what that might feel like. So that could emerge from certain types of energetic practices and or relational practices, where we might pick up a flame and sit with it and try to feel the flame inside of our body in some sort of relational aspect. But today, because sensation and the ability to feel is both held up as really important and also not really something that people can do really well, because we're so shut down, that's a good place to start is sensation in direct experience with wild primal forces, getting out in nature and trying to feel the places in which nature and you become each other, and where the separation and segregation is not really real, where it's kind of just an illusion of perception. How can you really separate the natural world from you and try to feel the natural world sensing you as you are sensing it? This bidirectional flow of energy that's occurring. Getting out and starting to give offerings. I think offerings are a great place to also begin. And so that might be giving offerings to ancestral spirits, It might be giving offerings to a tree that we really appreciate that's in our yard. It might be going to the ocean and giving offerings to the ocean. And just starting that process of trying to give something back in relationship. And
I love that, by the way. That's one of our top recommendations, is to start an offerings practice. It's one of those things that sounds, if you haven't experienced that, you can listen and go like, how would that change anything? There is something incredible. As soon as you start to engage in that way, things change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty much found in almost every indigenous culture that we have looked at, some sort of offering practice. It's at some level, it's almost like the world giving itself back to itself. But yeah, it really does something absolutely powerful. I agree that any attempt to reclaim a magical worldview would benefit from an offerings practice. And yeah, it really does.
I love the way
incredible.
you said that. You said something like, it's like the world giving back to itself. And I guess really that's what's going on. It's like really brings humans like back into that flow, back into that relationship, doesn't it? It's like you are, but you get to see that you are when you are consciously participating.
Yeah. Now that I think of it, I think the first time I heard someone say something along those lines in that language was that podcaster I mentioned earlier, Joshua Schrei. So yeah, it's a very good way to put it. It's exactly what you said. So then from there, I think learning to start being comfortable speaking to well, I guess that ties into offerings as well, but there's this process of learning to speak again to the world, and learning to actually engage in relationship through verbalization. I find that that's often a really difficult place for people.
Yes.
Yeah, when they actually start speaking to a tree, or speaking to what they sense as a spirit, or speaking to a picture of a grandparent, or whatever the case may be, but that honest weaving of words, of engaging verbally, I think is a great place to also begin. And fundamentally, I also think that having an ancestral practice is really useful. And a big part of why that is that it's really difficult to go deeply with ancestors without expanding your capacity for magic. If you go back in any ancestral line far enough, and we're only talking about a couple thousand years in most cases, which is nothing in terms of the human story, we have people who were shamans and medicine people and healers and seers and visionaries, and all of that is in your line. And we're probably talking about millions of individuals inside of your line that were like that. And so if you go deeper into ancestor practice, that is there to support you. And for me, it's been that connection has been one of the most useful as well in reclaiming a magical worldview, is literally letting them teach me how to do that. And it's not always easy, right? It's not always fun. And sometimes it's difficult, where pillars of your perception and aspects of your identity that are wrapped up in the contemporary story literally start to melt and dissolve. It can be uncomfortable, but that's the gold is underneath all of that, right? And so, yeah. Those would be my primary suggestions that I could give in the context of the podcast, right?
Oh, yeah. Really, really beautiful. And yeah, I wholeheartedly agree and support all of those. And the way they very much kind of interlink as well, you know, when you're talking there about our own ancestors, I've got this kind of seemingly random bit of DNA. I've had my DNA done, and I've got something like this 1% Siberian ancestry. The rest of my ancestry is all European, mostly British. And through the work I've done, that Siberian heritage started to, you know, specific ancestors within it started to speak to me. And there's so much work for me to do in really creating that relationship. And one of the ways to do is to make offerings. So this is all so, you know, ultimately it's all interweaved so beautifully. And it's all there, you know, it's all there to be reclaimed. It's all there for us to create a relationship with.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, and if you go back far enough too in the rest of your ancestry that's not Siberian, there is all of that exists as well in the indigenous Europeans, right? So, you know, you go back just 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years, and you have, I mean, even less than that, and you have a beautiful indigenous European heritage that was just as involved in all of these layers of perception and magical worldview and magical practice as any other culture.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's all there. And so
it's quite weird that you say that, actually, because you know, my own lineage of shamanism is very British. It's very like rooted in connection to the British land, and you know, as much as we can reclaim it. Obviously, there isn't a direct live lineage, but the interesting thing, literally in the last week, I've started to have like a druidic ancestry starting to be revealed. And yeah, so you're absolutely right. We don't actually have to go all that, you know, it's like there for all of us in whatever direction we look, really.
Sure, yeah, totally. And so I mean, I think that some of the aspects that come from living traditions today can really be helpful to help us set up a platform. And then once we have that platform, I see no reason why, once you know what you're doing to some degree, that you can't learn directly from spirits.
Yes.
Right? That direct engagement that can be instructive. And for a lot of our ancestors, that's how they learned, was through this relationship with spirits that were teaching them what to do and how to do it. And so that's kind of one of the layers, is that it's a relational practice, right? So when we really are engaging with these forces, it's not just about, you know, me and what I want to do. It's a relational, living, breathing dynamic where this other, whatever this other is showing you how to do things, is asking you to do things a certain way, is giving you the perception, the tools, the tactics, the strategies to let you do the magic. And so then it becomes, then the practice itself becomes a node, so to speak, that is this liminal space between you and the spirits, right?
Yes.
And yeah, anyway.
At least as passionate as I am. I love it so much. So we are out on time. Where can listeners find out more about you? And you know, you've already shared like a wealth of wisdom. I'm sure listeners would love to find out more. Where can they go and find all about you?
Sure, yeah. So I run a website called theancestralnow.com. And I also have a book out called The Ancestral Now, which can be found on Amazon. And
Wonderful.
so, yeah, those are the two places where they can locate me. I don't really do a whole lot of social media. If people want to directly interact with me, they can email me, which they can find on my website, or Telegram me, because I will do Telegram, just back and forth conversation. So, yeah.
Amazing. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Ramon.
Thank you, Lian. It has been a pleasure. I agree. Yeah.
Thank you.